Hey, I'm just trying to put together a theory of the mind. Just trying to cobble a couple of things that I know, which is extremely limited, because I've only gone through a very, very limited body of knowledge when it comes to the different theories of the mind. Actually, I haven't gone through all the theories of the mind even. I don't even know how many there are. I'm just beginning to get into Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works, and I'm on one of the first couple of pages. And yeah, I figured I'd kind of put something together, cobble something together in order to be able to understand how the mind starts, kind of how consciousness starts emerging. Well, the emergent phenomena of consciousness starts booting up. And I'm just trying to put together the framework through which the system, the way I think it actually works. This is probably take one of many takes. I don't know how many, probably thousands, if not tens of thousands. But the intention would be to figure out how this works, how the mind really works. So Pinker suggests on page 4 of his book, How the Mind Works, that human psychology is said to be explained by a single omnipotent cause, which is the large brain, and it is inputs through these mechanisms that actually constitute consciousness or the mind to form whatever structures and knowledge representation it needs for it to do the things it does. So the inputs would be culture, language, socialization, learning, and there's, I believe, 3 different kinds of learning. He doesn't categorize that. I just got that from somewhere else. And I use that as an example in order to be able to kind of expand on how each one of these will have sub-branches and how they would all feed into the theory of the mind. So these are models that have to be developed. So the other kind of phenomena are complexity, making sense out of it, self-organization, and the dynamics of the neural networks, which is generally how the brain works. Because neural networks and how we have pioneered them are based on how neurons actually function in the brain. Okay, so what I did next was, because I want to get to functional stuff, there's a lot of information and as it can be had when it comes to how the brain functions or how the mind functions. But my gut feeling is that, it's actually Jeff Hawkins articulated this really well in his book on intelligence, where he says it is from memories that we associate the patterns from which consciousness arises. So like I've said this so many times, it's something that really stuck with me. And, memories is like the whole question of memories, how they're formed, sorting, categorization, assigning attributes to them, how they are generated based on subjective experiences or altered states of consciousness, which I'm not getting into right now. But it's really that association within the different memories that results into the formation or the reality that consciousness emerges in an emergent fashion. It is that interlinking, it is those patterns that the connection of memories form. So next I kind of, this is something I learned recently, but short-term memories, when you take them through a region of the brain called the hippocampus, which is like this red part right here, then surprisingly enough, short-term memories turn into longer-term memories. And this is a verified phenomena based on the research done by this individual by the name of Theodore or Ted Berger. He's actually created a neural prosthetic for this very fact, and I believe they've tested it in rodents. And you have the formation of longer-term memories, and only because they are led through something called the hippocampus. Who would have thought? And I don't know if this is part of Berger's research, but I know this for a fact that eventually memories are written to cells in a redundant fashion. So they're not actually stored in neurons, they're stored within cells in a distributed format. What I don't know is if these are computer went to sleep. If these are cells within the neurons or if they are kind of spread out across the different regions of the neocortex or the brain in general. So that's something I need to check and find out. So I was just kind of doing some research, trying to put this together, and I'm like I said, my intention is to kind of figure out what the theory of the mind is going to be. So one of the things I know is that the brain fires up based on the different patterns it recognizes, and it appears to be the fact that the brain, with the mind as an operating system, is just like one big pattern recognizing machine. So it's always doing sorting, filing, categorizing, making sense out of reality in terms of the subjective experiences that we have. And, I said this a couple of months ago, perhaps last year, where I said it's quite possible that there could be objective underpinnings when it comes to all the subjective experiences that we have. And what I mean by that is that there could be many algorithms that work together in a seamless fashion. We don't see that because the interaction that we see is just one single coherent experience, which is a combination of different senses powering that reality. But it's quite possible that there are many different algorithms driving that. It's got to be that. There has to be some objective experience or set of experiences driving this phenomena. So those are really the kind of objective experiences that I would personally be interested in order to be able to put together this theory that I'm after. And one of the first ones that come at the top of my mind is this mention of the Jennifer Aniston neuron, and I believe the individual there's a bunch of different teams and individuals that have led this research, but they found out that the brain fires the same neuron in response to being shown an image of Jennifer Aniston. And it could be anyone. It could be Bill Clinton. The psychological underpinnings comes from something called the grandmother cells. This used to be the theory, and now it's verified that, yes, it is the same neurons or a couple of them that fire in response to being given a certain stimuli. The couple of them fire together because information is written to the brain in a redundant fashion, so it could be one or the other. What's interesting is that if somebody is shown a picture of Lisa, where is this? If somebody's shown a picture of Lisa Kudrow, I believe that's how you pronounce her last name, who's another one of the cast members from Friends, then the same neurons fire. It's so interesting that the same Jennifer neurons fire when being shown an image of Lisa Kudrow, which gives credibility to the fact, or the theory at least, that how memories are written in the brain involves a rich set of kind of association and attributes that are assigned to them. Plus, there's a lot of other interesting phenomena happening, because not just the writing of the memories into the individual cells by itself, there's a lot of association, interlinking happening. And there's like some really interesting stuff happening when it comes to how the memory formation, memory formation cycle is happening. Another one of the things I realize is that it's not just the information that's written to the brain, but it's the pattern. So it looks like it's like anytime you acquire any kind of learning that happens, it's not that it's just the information related to that experience is written. I don't have the words, but it's the actual pattern that remains. So it's I think you could call it experiential knowledge, but it's the pattern that remains which allows you to pull that memory again in order to be able to kind of carry out not a task, but any pattern recognition activity at that. So next I started looking into something called There's an individual by the name of George Miller. He was an American, I believe he is an American cognitive psychologist. I'm just going to make my computer come back from sleep. And Mr. Miller, his theory states that the working memory stores information in chunks. So these chunks could be single digit, they could be a single word, they could be a single digit letter, word, or a group of small words, or a couple of words. And we can only store 7 of these in the working memory. And to get over the limit of 7, what the brain uses is it uses a clever trick of recoding. So, if, like, say you're reading a body of text and you go from one line to another, as soon as you move on to the next line, the previous line or the previous couple of lines will be recoded into a single bit of, it's not a bit of memory, it's just like one of those single slices of memory, as opposed to the 7 that you work with. So that's how you kind of move forward. What happens to that memory that's already written? It's a very interesting question, I believe, because therein lies the underpinning of what exactly is happening in that short-term memory in order for you to convert it into something longer term. Because it's not just a memory anymore, it's a pattern. And however that pattern is written to the brain, and I believe by reverse engineering that process, we could glean a lot of interesting insights. So perhaps that goes back to the research that Ted Berger has done, and more needs to be done in order to be able to unravel the mechanism of how that encoding actually is happening, so that we can reverse that process somehow in order to be able to determine how the recoding can also happen. All right, so next I want to talk about something that Mr. Ray Kurzweil talks about. It's his theory. It's called PRTM, which stands for Pattern Recognition Theory of the Mind. And Mr. Kurzweil is of the opinion that the brain is, or the mind, this comes from his book, How to Create a Mind. And Mr. Kurzweil is of the opinion that the mind is a collection of 300 million pattern recognizers. So he gets into a couple of other models. He kind of borrows from Jeff Hawkins and Dilip George, I believe his last name, when it comes to their theories about like the different hierarchical structures and whatnot. And he gets into a couple of other things. But he mentioned the pattern recognizers. And a couple of things that he mentioned when it comes to this theory is that the recognition of pattern by pattern recognition modules in the neocortex is what drives this phenomena. These patterns and the modules are organized in hierarchies. And I already mentioned there are 3 million pattern recognizers, according to Mr. Kurzweil. And he also states that higher level patterns reference lower level patterns. So he kind of gets into the example of how we are always doing like edge detection as part of at least the visual system. That's the example he used in this scenario. And so when we're looking at letters, we're detecting the edges, and then the letter itself, and then the word, and then finally goes from there onwards. So I think this has analogies, or actually it looks like a very, very credible reference to what George Miller suggested in terms of memory getting chunked. And let me actually pull this up. I should have bookmarked this page. I called him, I kind of used the reference to the Markov models. But this is, I hope I don't get sued by Mr. Kurzweil or his publisher for doing this. But the pattern recognition looks something like this. So you start with a single letter, then the word, then kind of sentences, and you kind of go from there. And it's a couple more examples. So if I remember correctly, what's happening here is that basically the mind. Is it still recording? Yeah. Basically, the mind is starting with these kind of lower level pattern recognizers, and it's always cross-referencing them with, higher level is cross-referencing lower level pattern recognizers all the time. And when it comes to, some of the other kind of models, if you want to call it, because there's a lot of complex set of activities happening, both from an electrochemical perspective as well as the models that exist in the mind for it to start emerging. It's really, I think this kind of makes sense. The PRTM, along with the fact that the information or the memories are getting chunked or getting written in chunks. So it kind of makes sense because if you think about how, from simple pattern recognition tasks, we move towards more advanced tasks like somebody at the door. More advanced tasks like abstract reasoning, ideation, a whole bunch of other set of activities. It makes sense that we start with these very, very low-level pattern recognizers, and once the brain has mastered the ability to be able to incorporate that as part of their learning structure, you move to higher level of abstraction. So which would go towards like these areas that Pinker has defined or categorized. So a lot of this feeds. They're all kind of happening all over the place, all over the time, but a lot of the subjective experiences would be powering the learning aspect, and contingent on the individual and what they do, you may be dealing with a rising level of complexity, which is a conversation by itself, and you got to do this. This is always happening, as in the neurons are always firing off in your brain, to be able to make sense out of information and how it make sense out of information and how it makes sense to you. And there's a big language component to it, culture in terms of conditioning, socialization. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I figured I just document some of these thoughts related to how I think it will be possible to put a theory of the mind together. And I think the key here is to capitalize upon insights. So I was recording this video on my phone, and I ran out of battery. But the comment I made at that time was, how do you determine, though, what is a key insight? I think that's a good question, but I think the key insights should be grounded in first principles. So when we say that it is from memory that we associate the patterns from which consciousness arises, that has an objective, like a scientific phenomena that is driving that observation. And we know that happens. So then the question is, how many of those phenomena do we have? And then the next question is, how do we put the right kind of insights together in a minimalist fashion in order to be able to get a bare bones version of a theory of a mind going? So, I got to get a little bit more into the works and as they've been done by individuals like Ben Goertzel, because some of the models he has developed, it is my understanding that they're already working. And this is super exciting because we have the underpinnings, or we have models actually that work or mimic a mind or a brain in some type, shape, or fashion. I don't know if it's complex enough for it to actually evolve into a kind of mind that a human being would inhabit, like a rational human being, like, not like a village idiot. But yeah, so it's super fascinating that that's happening. And I don't want to end the note. I don't want to end the video on that note. But yeah, this is my first attempt at the theory of the mind, and I will. That's it. Goodbye.